There is a knowledge that cannot be taught in classrooms, written in textbooks, or passed down through lectures. It does not live in the mind, it lives in the soul. And over 8 centuries ago, one of the most extraordinary mystics who ever lived spent his entire life trying to show humanity where to find it. His name was Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi. And what he revealed about the nature of the soul and the highest form of knowledge still shakes the foundations of philosophy, theology, and spiritual seeking to this day. Let us begin with a question that most people never think to ask. What do you actually know? Not what you have memorized, not what you have studied, but what do you know in the deepest, most unshakable sense of the word? Most of us would point to facts, to data, to information we have accumulated over years of reading, education, and experience. And there is nothing wrong with that. That kind of knowledge is useful. It helps us navigate the world. But Ibn Arabi called that kind of knowledge ilm, ordinary, acquired, intellectual knowledge. And while he respected it, he spent his life pointing beyond it. Because he believed with absolute conviction that there was another kind of knowing available to human beings. A knowing so profound, so intimate, so total, that it could not be separated from the one who knew. He called it marifa. Marifa is not a concept. It is not an idea you can hold at arm's length and analyze. It is gnosis, direct, unmediated experiential knowledge of the divine reality. The word itself comes from the Arabic root arf, meaning to know, but not in the sense of knowing about something, in the sense of knowing something from the inside, knowing it as it truly is. Ibn Arabi was born in Murcia, in Islamic Spain, in 1165. He was a child of extraordinary sensitivity, and from the earliest days of his youth, he experienced states that could not be explained by ordinary categories. Visions, encounters, openings. By the time he was a young man, he had already entered into spiritual experiences that most people spend their entire lives seeking and never find. He traveled across the Islamic world, Andalusia, North Africa, the Hijaz, Anatolia, and finally Damascus, where he spent the last years of his life and where he now rests. And everywhere he went, he wrote. He wrote enormously. His complete works may number over 300 volumes, of which the most celebrated is Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, the Meccan Revelations, a work of staggering scope and depth. His other masterpiece, Fusus al-Hikam, the Bezels of Wisdom, is perhaps the most studied and most controversial text in the entire tradition of Islamic mysticism. What made Ibn Arabi so singular and so challenging was that he did not simply describe spiritual experience. He attempted to construct an entire metaphysical architecture that could account for it. He asked, what is the nature of reality such that an experience like marifa is even possible? To understand his answer, we need to understand one of his most famous and most misunderstood teachings, Wahdat al-Wujud. This term is usually translated as the unity of being or the oneness of existence. And on the surface it sounds simple. Everything is one, God is all is God. But Ibn Arabi never intended it to be understood so crudely. He was not a pantheist saying that every rock and tree is God in some flat literal sense. He was making a far more subtle and sophisticated point. He was saying there is only one existence, one being that truly, absolutely, unconditionally is. And that being is the divine, what he called al-Haq, the real. Everything else that exists, every creature, every soul, every particle of matter exists only by participating in that one being. Nothing else has existence of its own. Nothing else stands independently. The universe is not separate from God, nor is it identical to God in a way that would collapse all distinction. It is rather a manifestation, a self-disclosure of the real. Ibn Arabi used a beautiful word for this process, tajali, divine self-disclosure. God, in an act of infinite creativity and love, discloses himself to himself through the mirror of creation. The universe exists so that the real might know itself in forms, in particularities, in the infinite diversity of beings. And this is where the human soul enters the picture, because according to Ibn Arabi, the human being holds a unique position in this cosmic drama. He drew upon the Quranic concept of the human being as Khalifa, the vicegerent of God on earth. But he deepened this idea in ways that no one before him had quite articulated. He taught that the human being is the isthmus, the barzakh between the absolute and the relative, between the infinite and the finite, between the hidden and the manifest. The human soul is structured in its deepest essence as a mirror, and not just any mirror, a mirror uniquely capable of reflecting all the divine names and attributes together, simultaneously, in a way that no other created being can. An angel, in Ibn Arabi's cosmology, might reflect one particular divine attribute with perfect intensity. The seraphic being of fire reflects divine majesty, for example. An animal reflects certain qualities of life and vitality. A stone reflects permanence, but only the human being, constituted as the insane Kamil, the perfect or universal human, contains within itself the capacity to reflect the totality. This is not a flattering description of ordinary human beings as we actually are. Most of us, Ibn Arabi would say, have covered our mirrors with dust. The capacity is there, the mirror exists, but it is veiled by ego, by forgetfulness, by attachment to what is not real. And this is precisely where Marifa comes in. Marifa is what happens when the mirror is polished. When the soul is purified sufficiently that the divine light can reflect clearly through it. When the kashfi, the spiritual unveiling, occurs, and the veil between the servant and the Lord becomes thin enough to see through. But Ibn Arabi was careful to say that even this framing is ultimately imprecise. Because in the deepest state of Marifa, there is no longer a knowing subject standing over against a known object. The usual structure of knowledge, knower, knowing, known, begins to dissolve. What remains is something that can barely be named. He speaks of fana, the annihilation of the ego self, not as a destruction, but as a clarification. The drop does not cease to exist when it enters the ocean, but it can no longer be located as a separate drop. And yet paradoxically, Ibn Arabi insists, this is not the final station. Baka, subsistence, continuation, follows annihilation. The mystic returns from the ocean to the shore, but now they carry the ocean within them. They walk in the world as an ordinary person. They eat, sleep, speak, and act, but they act from a place of permanent, underlying recognition. This is the Arif, the Gnostic, the one who possesses Marifa. And Ibn Arabi's entire project was, in a sense, an attempt to describe what that state is like and to map the path toward it. Now here is something that is often misunderstood about Ibn Arabi, and it is important to address it clearly. His teaching has sometimes been accused of dissolving individual identity, of suggesting that the self simply disappears into the formless divine and that nothing particular matters. This is a misreading. Ibn Arabi was fascinated by individuality. He was fascinated by what he called the Ayn al-Thabita, the fixed essence or immutable entity of each being. Before any creature comes into existence, it has a unique, irreplaceable reality in the divine knowledge, not as something separate from God, but as a particular possibility, a specific mode of self-disclosure. And that particularity does not dissolve in Marifa, it is rather fully realized. The goal is not to erase the self, it is to see the self truly, to see its source, its nature, its relationship to the real, and from that seeing, to act with full presence, full clarity, full love. This is why Ibn Arabi described the Kamil, the complete or universal human, not as someone lost in mystical abstraction, but as someone fully present and fully functioning in the world. The prophets, for him, were the supreme examples of this realization. And the model of the Prophet Muhammad, in particular, was the supreme embodiment of the complete human being. Why does any of this matter today? We live in an age of extraordinary information and extraordinary confusion. We have access to more data than any generation in human history. And yet, by many measures, we are more spiritually disoriented, more anxious, more fragmented than ever. Ibn Arabi's diagnosis, were he alive today, might be something like this. You have accumulated enormous ilm, but you have forgotten that there is a higher kind of knowing available to you. And without that knowing, without marifa, all your information becomes noise. He is not asking you to abandon the intellect. He is not asking you to distrust reason or to flee from the world. He is asking you to recognize that the intellect alone, however brilliant, however well trained, cannot reach the depths of what is real. Because the intellect works by distinction, by separation, by standing apart from what it examines. and what is most real does not yield to that approach. What is most real can only be known by a kind of participation. The heart must be polished, the mirror must be cleared, and then not by force, not by cleverness, not by technique, but by grace and by readiness, the knowing that has always been present becomes available. Ibn Arabi said something in the Fusus al-Hikam that has echoed through centuries of commentary and controversy. He wrote that the real is the mirror in which the human being sees themselves, and the human being is the mirror in which the real sees itself. Two mirrors, facing each other, and between them an infinite depth of reflection. This is the hidden reality of the soul that Ibn Arabi spent his life revealing, not something exotic, not something reserved for scholars or saints alone, but something latent in every human heart, waiting as it has always been waiting for the moment of recognition. The question he leaves us with is not abstract, it is deeply personal. Have you polished your mirror?